In 1932, the government of Australia decided to declare war, not on a country, not on a group of people, but on the Australian emu, a 37 kilogram or 81.5 pound flightless bird, and a 5.75 foot or 1.75 meter tall bird that was destroying the crops of farms in the town of Campion in the state of Western Australia. With many victories in battles under Australia's belt, such as the Battle of Hamel and the Battle of Mont St. Quentin, and hundreds more during World War I, surely with the amount of victories that Australia had achieved in different wars, the Australian military would be able to win this quote-unquote war, right? Before diving into the Emu War, we need to go into the background, and to understand the origins of why there was a so-called Emu War, we need to go back to 1918, when World War I ended. The Australian government introduced a new program that aimed to sell and lease land to returning veterans from the war. The land that the government aimed to sell was called Crown Land. Anyways, the program that the Australian government introduced, named the Australian Soldiers Repatriation Act 1917, which was an act of parliament that started some sort of commission, where on the federal parliament level, the Repatriation Committee consisted of 7 members. One member being the Minister of Repatriation, who was Edward Millen, a member of the Nationalist Party, as well as 6 members of the public, which includes 2 returned members from the army. State and territorial commissions were also established, following a structure similar to the Federal Repatriation Committee. States also established acts, which were made similar to the Soldiers Repatriation Act 1917, however outlined what provisions were given to soldiers, like in the form of money or land. In Western Australia, where the setting of this video is located, soldiers who were located here were leased land brought by the West Australian government, which is consisted of private land which is owned by individuals, and Crown Land. Crown Land is land that doesn't have a specific role, unlike national parks. The Western Australian government allotted 1,095 plots for provisions to returning soldiers, totaling up to around 9,094,711 acres or 36,865 square kilometer land, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The reason why farmland was given to soldiers is that the government planned for the soldiers to use the land for farming crops, both for exporting and for domestic use. So, World War I ended, the soldiers returned. The government provided land and sometimes even money to the returning soldiers, and now the next event will be the Great Depression in 1929. The Great Depression posed many challenges to the people of Australia, and you could also probably call the Great Depression the reason why the Emu War started. In Australia, the Great Depression heavily affected the economy in an extremely negative way, with unemployment rates skyrocketing, the deflation of currency, higher poverty rates, and the list goes on. The Prime Minister at the time was James Scullin, who became the Prime Minister 2 days before the 1929 Wall Street crash, which was basically the catalyst of the Great Depression. The Prime Minister, James Scullin, launched an initiative called the Grow More Wheat Initiative, aiming to convince farmers to farm more wheat in order to solve Australia's horrific balance of trade problem. Balance of trade is basically the difference between the value of imports and exports of a country within a specific time period, usually a financial year. There was heavy opposition to this initiative, as people saw this as burdening the farmers, most of which being veterans of World War I. However, this program was not supported by the Commonwealth Bank and the Senate. Now, with Australia's economy collapsing, poverty rates extremely high, unemployment extremely high, the currency having barely any value due to devaluation, and all the farmers had left was their farm, crops and animals, and the food that they gathered from their animals or crops. Of course, the people would do a thing that makes a lot of sense and totally not a waste of money, resources and time, right? Okay, so now the farmers, and you could probably include the entire population of Western Australia, now have many problems. First, the Great Depression. Second, the veterans were given farmland in order to make a living could not get a large enough yield, poor fertility of the soil, and the emus. Now, you at home may ask, why are emus such a big problem? They can't do that much. Well, what the emus were doing was quite mischievous. Basically, the farms had fences aiming to keep animals out like the rabbits, emus, and other pests. During 1932, there was a large drought in Western Australia, meaning that all the emus started scraping the barrel for food, and the place where you can get large amounts of food in a relatively small area is a farm. The emus destroyed fences and created gaps in fences leading into farms. The farms had large amounts of food and water, making the area a good place to set up habitat for the emus. One emu eating the wheat in the farm or any other crops in the farm turned into 10, and then 100, and the number grew larger and larger, with the estimated amount of emus in Campion, Western Australia reaching up to 20,000 due to word of mouth amongst the emus and other animals spreading faster and faster. Other animals that previously would have been prevented from entering the farm due to the fence finally had the ability to get inside the farm and destroy the crops, like the rabbits. Due to the emus and rabbits, as well as other animals, the crops became spoiled, were eaten or were ruined by the ravage of animals coming to the farms of Campion. These farmers grew extremely tired of this, and so the farmers sent a delegation of people, mostly comprising of veterans of the Great War, to the Minister of Defense, who was George Pierce at the time, and requested for the military to intervene with culling of the emus. The delegation requested that the military be armed with machine guns, more specifically the Lewis gun. The Lewis gun had the capacity up to 97 rounds, and the delegation, most of which served in World War I, knew that the Lewis gun would be very effective with getting rid of the emu problem. Or so they thought. George Pierce agreed with this, as he saw that this opportunity could be used to provide training to Australian soldiers in the form of target practice and getting rid of the rising Western Australian secession movement, as well as providing propaganda value for the military and the federal Australian government. Pierce was also a senator for Western Australia, so he saw this opportunity of quote-unquote helping out the farmers as increasing his popularity amongst rural Western Australia for helping out farmers in a time of need against the emu threat. Pierce also added a few conditions that had to be fulfilled by the Western Australian government and the people / farmers of Western Australia, which were: the state government must funding for the transportation of troops throughout the duration of the Emu War. The Lewis guns, as well as other guns provided, will only be used by the military, and the farmers of the region provide accommodation and food for the soldiers. With the deployment of the Australian military with the reluctant approval of the Australian Parliament, the First Emu War began. However, there were a few setbacks to the beginning of the First Emu War due to rainfall making the emus scatter all around a larger area. When the rains finally ceased on the 2nd of November, the 7th Heavy Battery Division of the Royal Australian Artillery, commanded by Major G.W.P. Meredith, arrived in the area of Campion, Western Australia, and was also joined by a group of cinematographers capturing video and images of the so-called Emu War. Apparently, the soldiers also had orders from military headquarters to get the skin of 100 emus and turn the feathers into hats for the cavalry. Subsequently, the troops spotted a mob of emus. However, the emus spotted by the army were out of range for the Lewis gun, so the army recruited the help of the farmers with rounding up the emus for an ambush. However, this attempt failed miserably when the flock of emus split up and ran in different directions at extremely fast speeds, reaching up to 50 km per hour or 31 miles per hour. Combining this with the distance of the emus from the troops meant that the chance of hitting the emus were close to zero. Later, the troops encountered a smaller mob of emus, and around the troops and emus had another altercation on the 4th of November when the group of soldiers waited along a billabong, which is a small lake area, for the emus to appear. The emus did appear, a large number in fact, said to be up to around 1,000 emus present near the billabong. Taking advantage of this situation, the gunners opened fire on the emus. However, by a stroke of luck on the emu side, the gun jammed after only 12 emus were killed. Major Meredith decided to move south the following day, where the emus were said to be more tamer and easier to kill. However, despite relocating, the efforts in culling the emu population still rendered as ineffective, and according to reports on the 6th of November, emus started forming groups with a leader who keeps a watch for any of the soldiers, while the rest of the emus in their group decimate farmland and warns the rest of the emus if the troops approach their position. Major Meredith then decided and said, "Screw it, if they're too fast for us, well guys, guess what? I'll be attaching this Lewis gun right on this truck, and hear me out. We speed up towards them, go guns blazing, and then this way we can kill all those emus, and then nothing will go wrong, and then once this is all over, we'll be praised as heroes." Or so he thought. The truck use could not catch up to the emus, and the land was so rough that the gunner had an extremely hard time aiming at the emus, resulting in no emus being killed. On the 8th of November, the Australian House of Representatives convened to discuss the Emu War due to the negative press surrounding this event, with some members of the Senate and House of Representatives calling George Pearce the Minister for the Emu War, with some saying that only a few emus were killed throughout this process, despite spending an upwards of 2,500 bullets throughout this operation, and Pearce withdrew the military on the same day. After Pearce announced the withdrawal of Australian troops from the Campion region, there immediately began to be complaints from the farmers and residents of Campion, as well as the Premier of Western Australia, which was James Mitchell at the time, as the emus were appearing in the thousands, destroying crops, wildlife and drinking all the water. As a result of this, Pearce decided to send in troops again on the 13th of November 1932, marking the start of the Second Emu War. Major Meredith was recruited again for the Second Emu War, and this time you could probably say that the Second Emu War went a bit more successfully this time, killing upwards of 100 emus a week until December 10, when the army was finally withdrawn. The Second Emu War proved to be more successful in terms of saving the little but remaining amount of wheat crops within the region. To recap, World War I ended. The Anzac soldiers returned home. The Australian government, with the assistance of the states, gave land to the returning soldiers that had horrible conditions for farming. The Great Depression started, the emus ravaged the farms, the military was called in twice, that killed a total of 986 emus, using up to 9,860 bullets in total, resulting in 10 bullets per bird. From the events of this video, we can safely say that the Emu War was a complete waste of time, resources and money.